He had the kind of voice that could stop time. When Keith Whitley sang, it wasn't performance. It was confession. His songs about pain, love, and loneliness felt too real, too personal, as if he'd already lived every lyric. In May 1989, at the height of his career, that voice went silent forever. The headlines called it a tragic accident. But decades later, as new details surfaced, from autopsy inconsistencies to hidden confessions, the truth behind his death became far more complicated than anyone imagined. The final goodbye. It was a bright spring morning in May 1989 when Keith Whitley pulled up to the Nashville airport. His wife, rising country star Lori Morgan, was leaving for a promotional tour in Alaska. Their goodbye was brief, tender, and full of small gestures that felt routine at the time. Keith handed her a card, handwritten, simple, filled with love and pride. "I love you," he wrote. "I'm proud of you." To Lori, it felt like any other goodbye between two busy artists. But within days, that same card would haunt her for the rest of her life. At the time, Keith seemed unstoppable. His album, Don't Close Your Eyes, had produced 3 consecutive #1 singles, his next record was nearly finished, and in just 2 weeks he was set to fulfill his lifelong dream: induction into the Grand Ole Opry. Behind the scenes, though, Keith's closest friends knew that his drinking had returned. He'd been fighting alcoholism since his teenage years, and while he had periods of sobriety, stress and loneliness often dragged him back. Lori's trip left him alone at home, a dangerous thing for a man who needed constant support to stay on track. That week, Keith stayed busy, or tried to. He wrote songs, met friends for coffee, talked about golf plans and studio sessions. He sounded optimistic, even happy. But addiction has a way of hiding in the quiet. On May 9, 1989, Keith's brother-in-law, Lane Palmer, stopped by the house. They talked for a while, drank coffee, and made plans for later. Palmer left just before 10 a.m. When he returned less than 2 hours later, Keith was in bed, motionless. Paramedics arrived quickly, but it was too late. Keith Whitley, just 33 years old, was gone. The unanswered questions. The official cause was acute alcohol poisoning. His blood alcohol level measured 0.47, nearly 5 times the legal limit to drive and enough to kill almost anyone. Police found no signs of struggle, no drugs, no suicide note, just an empty house, a still body, and a man who had finally lost his fight. But from the very beginning, people close to Keith felt something didn't add up. He had spent the weekend drinking, yes, but he had also been making plans, rehearsals, golf, songwriting. This didn't look like someone ready to give up. And then came the toxicology report. Traces of Valium and cocaine appeared alongside alcohol. Friends insisted Keith didn't use cocaine. It didn't fit his habits. Even stranger, the autopsy was performed by Dr. Charles Harlan, a Tennessee medical examiner who years later would lose his license for falsifying reports and mishandling remains. When those accusations surfaced in the mid-1990s, fans began to wonder, had the same man made mistakes in Keith's case too? Lori Morgan said years later that she was haunted by the inconsistencies. She had questions no one could answer. Why wasn't a deeper investigation done? Who entered the house before the paramedics arrived? Rumors began that someone might have tampered with the scene to protect reputations. Whispers suggested that drugs were hidden before police showed up. None of it was ever proven, but the silence from authorities only fueled suspicion. For fans, Keith's death had become more than a tragedy. It had become a mystery. A life on the edge. To understand how Keith Whitley's story ended, you have to start in the hills of eastern Kentucky, where his story began. Born Jackie Keith Whitley on July 1, 1954 in Ashland, and raised in the small, tightly knit town of Sandy Hook, Keith's world was one of coal dust, church choirs, and mountain songs. His father, Elmer, worked in the steel and coal industries, a quiet, hard-working man who carried stress like a shadow but rarely spoke of it. His mother, Faye, was the emotional anchor of the family, deeply spiritual and fiercely protective. She saw something rare in her youngest son, not just a love for music, but a depth of emotion far beyond his years. Keith didn't talk much, but when he sang, the room fell silent. He had the kind of voice that could make ordinary people cry. From a young age, Keith absorbed the culture around him, the sound of fiddles drifting from front porches, gospel harmonies rising from church pews, and the stories of struggle and faith that defined Appalachian life. Music wasn't entertainment. It was survival. In families like the Whitleys, songs were how people dealt with loss, loneliness, and the harshness of the mountains. Keith learned early that singing was more than talent. It was therapy. But his childhood wasn't without shadows. Money was tight, and opportunities were few. The roads were dangerous, both literally and figuratively. When Keith became a teenager, that restlessness, that need to feel something, began to surface. He had charisma, charm, and a wild streak that made him magnetic to friends and trouble alike. By the time he was 13, he had already been drinking. Alcohol wasn't seen as taboo in the hollers of Kentucky. It was part of the culture. Older men drank to forget, and young boys often followed their lead. Then came the accident that changed everything. One night, Keith and his older brother Dwight were riding through the twisting mountain roads with a friend. They were speeding, laughing, reckless, young, until the car lost control. It went off the side of a cliff, plunging 120 feet into the valley below. Their friend was killed instantly. Dwight was badly injured. Keith was thrown from the car and survived almost miraculously with minor wounds. To outsiders, it was a lucky escape. But for Keith, it left invisible scars. It was his first confrontation with death, the first moment that made him realize how fragile everything was. That night haunted him for the rest of his life. After the crash, Keith grew quieter, more inward. He began pouring himself into music. His brother Dwight encouraged him, teaching him guitar chords and harmonies. The Whitley household might have been small, but it was filled with sound. The music of Ralph Stanley, Carter family, Bill Monroe, and the Stanley brothers. Keith spent hours practicing, his voice maturing quickly, rich with ache and wisdom far beyond his teenage years. People in Sandy Hook began to take notice. By the time he was 9, he could outsing most adults in the county. But the same intensity that made him a musical prodigy also made him self-destructive. By high school, he was known for his dangerous stunts, speeding through mountain curves, drinking hard, and daring fate. It wasn't that he wanted to die. It was that he didn't seem to fear it. His friends would later say he carried himself like a man who already knew life would be short. At 14, he began performing locally with Dwight and their small band, playing church socials and talent contests. One night, they entered a competition in Eel, Kentucky, and fate intervened. In the crowd was a fellow teenage musician named Ricky Skaggs from nearby Cordell. The two boys hit it off immediately. Their voices, when they sang together, blended so perfectly it was almost eerie. Within weeks, they were performing side by side, and their reputation spread through the region. Not long after, bluegrass legend Ralph Stanley happened to hear them play. He was rebuilding his band, the Clinch Mountain Boys, after the death of his brother Carter Stanley. When Ralph heard Keith and Ricky harmonize, he offered them both a place on the spot. Keith was just 15 years old. For a boy from the Appalachian Hills, this was a dream come true, and a trial by fire. Touring with Stanley's band meant playing night after night, learning discipline, and facing grown men's temptations long before he was ready. Ralph was strict. He demanded respect for the music, precision in performance, and humility on stage. Keith earned all of it. His raw, haunting tone captivated audiences wherever they went. But it was on the road that Keith's demons began to grow. The endless travel, the loneliness of hotel rooms, and the constant adrenaline left little room for stillness. Drinking was common in the bluegrass world. It was how musicians passed the time between shows, how they dealt with exhaustion and homesickness. For Keith, it became more than a habit. It became a refuge. Ralph Stanley would later say that even back then he worried about the boys drinking. Keith wasn't even 17 yet. Still, nothing could hide his brilliance. He sang with the soul of a man who had lived 1,000 heartbreaks. His voice carried the weight of tragedy, faith, and longing, all before he'd even begun to live. That combination, vulnerability and danger, became his signature. He was, even then, walking a tightrope between greatness and destruction. By the mid-1970s, Keith and Ricky Skaggs formed their own duo, Whitley and Skaggs, gaining attention throughout the bluegrass circuit. But Keith was restless again. He wanted more than bluegrass could give, more emotion, more reach, more risk. He wanted Nashville. And that hunger, that never-ending reach for something bigger, would define the rest of his short, brilliant, and tragic life. The Nashville Dream. By 1982, Whitley was restless. He loved bluegrass, but he wanted more. Nashville was calling. He moved there with little money and a mountain of ambition. He signed with RCA Records in 1983, releasing his debut, A Hard Act, to follow the next year. It didn't sell. But he wasn't discouraged. He just wanted to find his sound. His next record, L.A. to Miami, changed everything. With songs like Miami, My Amy, and Homecoming 63, he finally broke through. His voice, smooth, soulful, aching, reminded fans of the greats, Lefty Frizzell, George Jones, and Merle Haggard. Around this time, Keith met Lori Morgan, daughter of Opry legend George Morgan. They married in 1986. Their love was fiery, devoted, but chaotic. Lori tried to save him from himself. She poured out bottles, hid car keys, tied his leg to hers at night so he wouldn't sneak out to drink. "I was fighting for his life," she later said. Keith adored her, but addiction doesn't negotiate. Then came 1988. The year that defined him. His album, Don't Close Your Eyes, was released, and country music changed overnight. The title track went number 1, followed by When You Say Nothing at All, and I'm No Stranger to the Rain. The record sold over 1 million copies, and fans hailed Keith as the revival of real country music, emotional, raw, and unfiltered. But the success came at a cost. The same perfectionism that made him brilliant also pushed him toward the bottle. Between shows and interviews, he drank in secret, trying to quiet the storm inside. To everyone else, he was a rising legend. To Lori, he was a man quietly slipping away. The day the music died, May 9th, 1989. The timeline was painfully ordinary. At 8:30 a.m., Keith shared coffee with his brother-in-law, Lane Palmer. They joked, planned a golf outing, talked about writing new songs. Palmer left the house around 10 a.m. When he returned an hour later, Keith was gone. The coroner ruled it alcohol poisoning. His body contained the equivalent of 20 drinks in his bloodstream. He was found fully clothed, face down on the bed, a half-empty bottle nearby. He had been alone for only a few hours. News spread fast. Country radio stations halted programming to play his songs. Outside RCA's Nashville headquarters, fans left flowers and handwritten letters. For days, the city mourned as if it had lost one of its own. Lori Morgan was in Alaska when she got the call. She collapsed, screaming, unable to breathe. When she returned home, she found the card he'd given her, his final message. In her memoir, Forever Yours Faithfully, She described the pain of realizing it might have been a goodbye she never recognized. She also wrote of haunting details, someone allegedly hiding a bag of cocaine before paramedics arrived, and a manager leaving the house after seeing Keith's fragile state. Whether those claims were true or not, they deepened the mystery. The question wasn't only how Keith died, but why no one stopped it. The legacy and the darkness left behind. The aftermath was devastating. His funeral in Nashville drew over 500 mourners, artists, producers, and lifelong fans. Ricky Skaggs gave the eulogy, barely able to speak through tears. Laurie placed a red rose in his casket and whispered, "I will always love you." He was buried in Nashville, beneath a headstone engraved with her words, "Forever yours, faithfully." Keith's final studio album, I Wonder Do You Think of Me, was released just months after his death. The title track and It Ain't Nothin' both went number 1. In 1994, Alan Jackson, Tracy Lawrence, and Alison Krauss released a tribute album. Krauss's cover of When You Say Nothing at All became her first major hit. Over time, Keith's legend only grew. In 2022, more than 30 years after his death, he was finally inducted into the Country Music Hall of Fame, the honor he'd once dreamed of, but never lived to see. Even now, the questions remain. Was it just alcohol, a fatal relapse, or was something darker overlooked, maybe even covered up? Dr. Harlan's later disgrace ensures we'll never truly know. What is certain is that Keith Whitley's pain was real, and so was his brilliance. He lived fast, loved deeply, and sang like a man who knew his time would be short. Keith Whitley's story isn't just about a death. It's about how genius and torment often walk hand in hand. More than 3 decades later, his songs still echo with the same honesty that once broke hearts across America. What do you think really happened in those final hours? Accident, neglect, or something else? Share your thoughts below, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more untold stories from the heart of country music.